Hello and welcome once again to the Fair Game podcast, We Love You Football. I'm Graham Miller, and in this episode we're looking at the very real financial problems faced by two of our oldest football clubs. Bury AFC and Bolton FC have suffered significant challenges in recent years, highlighting the broader issue of financial stability in the game. Both experienced boardroom mismanagement, which led to Bury being expelled from the Football League back in 2019, and Bolton, well, they were placed into administration in the same year after years of financial difficulties and were just hours away from liquidation. Each club is deeply rooted in their local communities, and their struggles have had a significant impact on their supporters and local economies. The Football League was criticised for how it handled their cases, and it all brought calls from supporters and other groups for better governance and stricter financial controls for owners. There's been some progress, and of course the Football Governance Bill going through Parliament is one of the outcomes. And Fair Game's been a driving force in calling for change, arguing for reform and lobbying for better safeguards to protect clubs in the future. Now we have a distinguished panel to talk through the current situation of Bolton and Bury and the anticipated arrival of an independent football regulator, and I'll introduce them to you after Niall Cooper, the CEO of Fair Game, brings us up to date with all the latest news.
So it's all politics at the moment. The Football Governance Bill is making its way through Parliament. Now, we identified 20 areas where we thought there was room for improvement. Since then, we have had numerous meetings with ministers, peers, civil servants and so on. And we have seen amendments tabled and questions asked in Parliament, all on our behalf. The result is, after all of that we've had reassurances on 14 of the 20 that will be taken forward. Of the remaining 6, conversations are ongoing, and we're hopeful progress can still be made, most notably on financial flow. So what happens now? Well, the bill is at the report stage in the House of Lords, where on the 11th and 17th of March, peers will have the chance to put forward amendments that will then be voted on. And we will obviously be pushing for some amendments there, so hopefully we can see some proper change. The amended bill then moves to the Commons, where it will go through further scrutiny, including the very last chance for any changes. Then it gets royal assent, in which at our current best guess is likely to happen in June, with the regulator starting work almost immediately. So it really is a case of pushing your local MPs to try and make sure that they back the bill and some of the changes that we're putting forward. Meanwhile, Fair Games Conference is fast approaching. On the 28th and 29th of May, football's great and good will gather at AFC Wimbledon. The first day will be dedicated to a series of practical workshops where key stakeholders will be encouraged to work together to come up with solutions to some of football's problems. The second day will have stalls, panels, keynote speakers, football style food, refreshments and so on, and plenty of networking opportunities as we look to build a fairer future for football together. To find out more about the event, including sponsorship opportunities and tickets, check out our website www.fairgameuk.org.
Okay, let me introduce you to our panel for this episode. We have Yasmin Qureshi, the MP for Bolton South, Bury North MP James Frith, author and journalist David Conn, whose work down the years has shed light on so many financial wrongdoings in the game, Martin Parnell from the Bolton Supporters Trust, Mo Dickson, a member of the Heritage Committee at Bury, and Niall's back with us to give us the Fair Game view on all of this. Well, let's start with James Frith. Now, you were in your first stint as Bury North MP back in 2019. How bad a time was it when the doors were slammed shut?
It was awful. It ripped the social, cultural, economic capital out of a town that was already enduring sizable change, loss of funding, both the threat and opportunity that is living within the shadow of one of our greatest English cities and all that that brings with it, both to football and the town. It was a absolute thump to everybody, and in fact, what it meant, whereas we had the sort of fortnightly drumbeat of home games and a narrative and an understanding of the town's momentum according to its football club and the club's performance, um, everybody on the doorstep that I was meeting and as I went about my business as the town's MP was affected by it, was alarmed by it, was concerned by it. It had a unifying effect. Some of that unity was lost in the months and years to come, but it was a real kick for a town that was already feeling quite vulnerable for the reasons I've explained.
Well, Bury are back, as it were. The club is still alive. You're back in the seat, of course, after last summer's general election. Are you seeing a difference now as you go round the houses and what have you?
Look, I mean, there is an incredible success story at the heart of this, which is down to the fans, and in spite of the regulation that football is moves within or operates under. I think, but for the work of the fans on both sides, I think it became a sort of two-sided affair, both in terms of the self-determination that we had a club to come back to with a team to play and watch, as well as those involved in the securing of the property of Gig Lane and having both the heritage to be able to continue with AFC, then becoming AFC again, which actually credit to the FA at the time. They were very clear in their view that this was always a possibility, and was why I supported the journey that it's been on. But the gate numbers alone are extraordinary. Thousands, 2,000 to 4,000 average, home and away if it was possible. So it's a huge success story, despite the being the victim of some pretty appalling behaviour and some of the rot that speaks to the problem that the game faces across leagues or down the pyramid.
Well, David Conn, you've written extensively about the football business in your books and newspaper articles. Is it fair to say that our less fashionable clubs, like Bury, like Bolton, that they've been continually exploited commercially and financially by their owners?
Well, yes. But in the case of Bury and the case of Bolton, I don't even know if you would say exploit that these were collapses that were caused by owners who were exploiting them. So just a little personal bit from me. I'm actually from the area, so I grew up in North Manchester, only a few miles from Bury, and I went to school in Bury. And I wrote a piece for The Guardian, which was a bit more of an emotional piece than all the financial investigations and charting the awful collapse, and just said that every day, twice a day on the bus, from the top deck of the 35 bus, I used to go past Gig Lane and see that lovely ground in that lovely situation behind the trees, and always loved going there. And so very much have a feeling for the club and the ground, and understand what James is talking about it being, how important it is to Bury as a place and for its identity and as a home and as a rallying point. So in my work for as you say, books and newspapers and for The Guardian, I would have obviously been writing about Bury anyway, but it always had a very personal added importance to me. Like, oh my God, not Bury again. No, they're not doing this again. because they went into administration in the early 2000s after sort of overachieving in football terms, but based on funding from an owner that wasn't sustainable. And there was a huge, there was like a whole public solidarity and people donating from all over the world and having their names on the seats in the Gig Lane stands. And it turned into a heartwarming story. So when nearly, however long, 15, 20 years later, they're overachieving again based on loans from an owner, you can just see this potential fall happening from a mile off. And I was really feeling very strongly how just disastrous, but also just how disappointing it was that this was happening again at Bury. And I contributed, I was asked to contribute. So I charted the collapse of Bury. You know, it's still actually, I'm actually getting quite emotional now just thinking of Bury Football Club being expelled from the Football League, Gig Lane just being empty, just having nothing, no football there, just being abandoned for so long. And as James said, just amazing efforts by the supporters to, you know, not see it die and to revive it. And, you know, that was fantastic, but it was, you know, it was a horrible, however long couple of years. And my dad's passed away now, but he still lived like a mile away from Gig Lane. So I went to just like pop round to the ground when I've been to visit him and just see it completely abandoned. Anyway, I was asked to, because of all my work for The Guardian, charting it all, I was asked to contribute to the EFL, the review that was done for the EFL, the independent review by the lawyer, Jonathan Taylor. And I met them. I met him and his colleague. And I just said to them, look, there just is a really simple principle here. Like, this has been really traumatic. This has been really catastrophic. I told them that it was personally emotional for me as well. And I told them that, you know, this is where I'm from. But I said, but there just is a really simple principle here, which is a club cannot overachieve and try to run itself based on short-term money that's being put in by an owner, whether that's by loans, which I think it was in Bury's case, or even if it was, you know, capital put in but only to fund players' contracts. It's not going to be sustainable. I remember John Taylor saying, but is that it? But what about this? And what about ambition? And what about a club need to rise? And I said, look, we can see what's happened to one of the most historic clubs in the game. It's just a very simple principle, unfortunately. And I think they basically adopted that in their review. And, you know, when you come down to just factual, analytical, what is the issue here? You know, UEFA started it with financial fair play. The Premier League followed it. The EFL has followed it. Whatever financial model, however you try to run it, at a time like this where there's billions at the top and lower divisions have always, you know, never had the same amount of money ever. But what you can't do is try to bridge gaps by short-term money from owners, because however wealthy they may be at that particular moment, things can always change. And if their economic circumstances change, then these historic clubs that people just support because they love them, because they're loyal to them, because they've grown up with them, because they're really important to their families, because they've got this huge emotional, you know, loyalty that they command, they are the ones who then fall into these catastrophic collapses.
How do you equate then the emotion of it all with the demands of 21st century finance and all the rest of it? Are you saying that these clubs shouldn't have the ambition? They should settle for where they are, or perhaps they're even an endangered species?
No, and that's exactly the question that Jonathan Taylor was asking me. And my answer to this is always the same, Graham, right? Which is no, like, especially at a time like this, clubs in general are actually, football and football clubs in general are actually thriving more than they ever have, really, arguably, if you look at it. Okay. But there's always been economic imbalance between a club in a big city and a small town club, and even a club in London and a club in the north. And that was always the case right from the very beginning of the Football League when it was formed in 1888. They literally had their first meetings in Manchester saying, but what are we going to do about fairness of competition between, let's say, an Accrington, a Derby County and an Everton, right? Or a smaller town and a big city club. And the answer has always been that revenues have to be shared, right? Mm-hmm. The answer to bridging the gap isn't, well, try and get a rich person to bung in a load of short-term money just to one individual club. All that does is inflate wages artificially for everyone else, plus puts that club at risk of a catastrophe when the owner's money runs out. But there's so much money. So they started right from the beginning sharing gate money, right from the very beginning. And then they stopped doing that in 1983, and we had the carve-up, the gradual carve-up that led to the Premier League breakaway from sharing money with the other three divisions. And that massively increased inequality in football. So the question of fair competition and ambition for clubs, right, that is all about sharing revenue, like the American sports do, to make sure that there's, that each franchise, as they call it, it's super commercial, but they understand that to create competition, we have to actually share revenues between, very profitable places and less well-off places. English football has moved away from that, but that is still the root answer to inequality of competition. And it is a disastrous solution to say, well, we've got this inequality of competition, so what we need is a rich owner to put some money in just to our individual club. And we've seen it over and over and over again that it doesn't work.
For Bury's sake, the issue was definitely not about the town or the fans or the club's ambitions, or indeed the owner looking or a billionaire owner. The problem actually was two successive owners should have, could have failed the fit and proper test, and that in fact, far be it from pumping any money in, they pumped debt and leveraged debt into the club. They left providers and suppliers unpaid. They saw a promotion that was unfunded, and ultimately that was what cost the club its league position and status, because of a judgment by the other clubs deeming an unfunded promotion a stretch too far. And so it's hard to see how the conclusion is anything other than being better at applying the existing rules, or to make rules that have to be enforced. Our injustice in the town was that all of the rules were ignored until the fans had to pay the ultimate price. And we were, as a club, a no fan fault eviction. We were victims of this joint enterprise crime, which was a failure to adhere to the fit and proper persons test originally, and successive owners doing nothing but operating as a sort of pound shop oligarch, fancying themselves as football club owners rather than doing what was right by the club. So notwithstanding David's excellent points on the wider issues of the game, but this Bury was not awash at any point, awash with cash from billionaire owners.
Just to make the point though, James, I'm not saying that the owners were billionaires. No, I'm not saying that. But the point that I'm making about funding is that one of the owners, the owner before Steve Dale, did put some millions in, but he put the millions in loans. And that's what led to the financial crisis of the club, because then he had his own financial difficulties and couldn't fund the club anymore. So the club was overspending based on the expenditure that it had taken on when he had been putting loans in. So the point that I'm making, so without him doing that and overspending, then there wouldn't have been a financial collapse.
Yasmin, let me bring you in here. You became the MP for Bolton South just after the club survived extinction, by the skin of its teeth, really. How different might things have been in the area if Bolton had disappeared?
I think the area would have been incredibly affected by it because Bolton Wanderers Club has always been part of the community, has so much involvement with the community there. And I think everybody would have been absolutely devastated, which is one of the reasons I remember jumping in when there was thought about it being put into administration. And I remember actually contacting the High Court and wrote a letter to them to say to the master at the High Court that give Bolton Wanderers an opportunity to, I think it was to do with some taxes they owed as well, which was leading to these problems. And I said, look, please delay it at least for a few more months, because if, for example, they get relegated, then they're losing even more money, because the system was such that if they had they not paid up the taxes, they wouldn't have been able to play. And we were at that stage where being able to play was really, really key to be able to get more money, but also not to get any penalties. So I remember stepping in there because I know that people of Bolton are absolutely very attached to the club, and it would have been absolute devastation. So I'm very keen on making sure that Bolton survives. But I just want to touch on what David and James are both saying. You're absolutely right. I think for any club to be able to work, they do need consistent funding, and they need a stream of money that's coming in. But it must be, as you say, a reliable money, and it isn't in the case of, like, for example, sometimes take loans and put it in, which then indebits the club. Now, we had at Bolton Wanderers, I know, as you probably all know, far better than I do even, that there was a time when we had that sort of situation where one person owned the club. We weren't sure quite where the money was going into, who was wherever. But now we have, of course, as you know, very much better situation where everybody knows who are the owners, and they're also connecting with the fans and with the community. So everybody knows what they're doing as well. And with Sharon, the lady who's now running Bolton Wanderers Football Club, the sort of the chairperson, who's also known as Auntie Sharon apparently to all the fans, she's running a really good ship, and we think that that's the kind of things really important for all clubs. There should be transparency of who the owners are, what amounts they put in, what they're going to gain out of it. But at the same time, I do believe that the Premier League should be pushed to share the profits that they make from their television rights that they get, because they get millions, hundreds of millions of pounds. And it's really unfair. They're just capped in the Premier League. And of course, the clubs that get relegated. That, of course, also makes it difficult because there will be matches of unequals taking place. And I think it's only fair that that money from the Premier League should be given to all the clubs much more fairly. That will then give the clubs consistent stream of funding, which then would allow them to be able to develop their club and their teams. And I think this is so important because, people love football. I was just thinking about the other day that I was born in Pakistan and I came to England when I was aged 9. And in Pakistan, everybody's mad about cricket, right? Wherever there's a spare space, people were playing cricket. And here in England, wherever there's a spare space, everybody's playing football. So it's very much part of our psyche. It's very much part of our kind of where, thinking is. And therefore, for me, it's really important that the game is capped at the local level, at a sort of lower leagues or higher leagues, wherever. But the game must be intact because people love it. And so I think we just need to have a better regulator. And as James was saying about fit and proper person test should be applied, and the regulator should be independent. I'm sure they will be. So there's lots needs to be done. I think it's really important, going back to what Graham said, is, we would have been devastated if Bolton had gone under.
Just on those stats. So at the moment, where it is there's the broadcast deal is worth £3.2 billion. That's how much comes into football every year. 88% of that stays with the Premier League.
That's right.
Of the remaining 12%, 7% of that goes to the clubs who've got themselves relegated from the Premier League in the last couple of years. That leaves 5% being split between something like the next 138 clubs. So when you look at the difficulty is to bridge the gaps, which David talked about, it's really hard. And yet you want to try and push up. Every fan wants to kind of progress up the pyramid, but the financial risk that you have to put your club under to try and bridge those huge gaps is getting massive and going bigger every single year. It has been for the last 20 years. So the problem is ultimately that financial revenue that's being split, because Bolton fans, Bury fans, I'm a Wimbledon fan, all of us want to progress up the pyramid.
Yeah.
But the financial risks you have to put yourself under to do so is absolutely, to be honest, it's catastrophic. And that's where we need to look at addressing it. That 88% that stays in the Premier League, that's the root cause, in my belief. And I think David talks about it and goes back to 1983 when sharing revenues stops and all of those sorts of stuff. That element where you've got the very top clubs looking after the very top clubs, and that's what's happened with the Premier League. And the rest of the football pyramid's really struggling to compete. And that's putting the heartache that you've heard from Yasmin and James, and I know we'll hear from Mo, and I know we'll hear from Martin, that puts those clubs under is just massive, and it's almost ignored by those clubs at the top end. And it's not clubs actually, it's the Premier League and how they look after themselves, which they're brilliant at doing. But they're not looking after the emotions of Mo or Martin or the constituents of James and the constituents of Yasmin.
Martin Purnell, you're part of the Bolton Supporters Trust. Now, excuse me, after what happened at Bury, I guess Bolton were the lucky partner. Do you feel almost you survived at Bury's expense?
Not really. I feel a bit of guilt that we didn't, they didn't, but I don't think it's a competition between clubs at all. And to pick up points that David and James made about owners, there are good owners and bad owners. There always have been. If you go back in Bolton, it's been the Warburtons for years, who didn't really get much engaged. There's Hargreaves, who built the stadium. But in the recent years, I'm very much aware of three owners. Eddie Davis, who was a wonderful benefactor, ex-orphan from Bolton. Then we had Ken Anderson, who should never have been let anywhere near a football club again after being a disgraced company director. And then Football Ventures, who are happily supporting us now. But the model is different. I remember talking to Phil Gartside in the Eddie Davis days, saying, what happens when Eddie dies, Dave? Have you got a plan? He said, yeah, don't worry, Martin, we've got it covered. Well, of course, they didn't have a plan. And that was the first brush we had with administration. Then we got Anderson, and he clearly, it's interesting. I think some bad owners sometimes have the interest of the clubs in their heart for a short time. Ken Anderson clearly, in the end, wanted to buy the ground, but we protected it in the Supporters Trust through an ACV, so he couldn't get his hands on it. But there was a time, I remember going to a reserve or under-21 match in Charlton, Millwall somewhere, and him and his son were sitting in the stands watching the under-21s, and they were clearly enjoying running a football club. Then it all turned sour. And now we've got Football Ventures, who we love, and Auntie Sharon, as Yasmin said, get on extremely well with them. We follow more or less the fair game and regulator rules that we're trying to instate in football in terms of meeting with the club on a regular basis. We have structured dialogue meetings on a quarterly basis. We have informal meetings with the hierarchy on a monthly basis. And we can see what they're trying to do. They try to be sustainable. Now, for the first 3.5, 4 years, when it was all going well and we're on the up and we didn't quite make the championship, their aim was Project Championship, was to get us there. And they were quite clear that when we got to the championship, they couldn't fund us in the Premier League. So they'd have to sell the club at that time. But they always said they'd sell it to a good owner, and we believed them, and we still do believe them. We've got other investors in now. But Sharon has talked to the select committee in Parliament about the evils of the parachute payments and how difficult it is. And I well remember her saying at the last session she had with them that if we get to the championship, when we get to the championship, she's going to have to go to investors and say, listen, I need 20 million just to stand still. I can't promise you anything other than staying in the championship. And that's a big ask to investors. So if you look at the three types of investors and owners that I'm aware of, all different models, but the point is, it's all about sustainability. And it's now quite obvious to us that in the last year or so, we can't achieve our sustainability goals and get promoted, given the state of the current League One, with Birmingham with all their millions, Wrexham with all their money. We have to go back into debt again to get promoted, and I don't really know where we stand on that with the current owners. It's a very interesting dilemma. The point is, we shouldn't have any of those three ownership models struggling to keep the club afloat for the community.
Bit of a left field question here to you, Martin. The club was so close to liquidation. Could it be said that COVID was partly responsible for saving the club because a government fund was used to offset those huge losses? Or is that totally ridiculous?
Yeah, we probably could. More opposite, I think, is the fact that we played behind closed doors for a year, and we had a new manager who was determined to play Pep Guardiola style football in League Two, and got the luxury of not having the crowd on his back to say that's ridiculous, just hoof it up the field. And we got promotion that year by playing football. Now, it's not ended that well because we're struggling now to replicate that football model, and we've lost that manager. But I was saying on the playing front, we got promotion because of COVID. I don't think I can really relate anything on the financial side to COVID. Although yeah, there is a point. We on the football broadcasting, I managed to watch every game on a computer screen that first year because of COVID. And the money that we all paid, because we had a lot of people paying their money to watch those games, £10 a game, that money probably did have a major contribution to our finances in COVID.
Mo Dickson, James has already mentioned a little bit about this, but tell us about the resurgence of Bury. And of course, for the last 18 months or so, you're back at Gig Lane. What does that all mean to the club in the area?
Where do you start? When the club were expelled by the EFL, it was basically the heart was ripped out of the town. It was a living, breathing entity, and the devastation was enormous, absolutely enormous. And I know from both personal experience and from many of the Bury fans that I've spoken to about it, the impact on the people's mental health, people who would turn up at Gig Lane or wherever we were playing that weekend, that was no longer there, and suddenly all of these people, thousands of people that would turn up week in, week out, it had gone. Absolutely, it just no longer existed. I mean, I don't know how anyone else could deal with it. I certainly know from a personal perspective, it certainly affected my mental health. I'd never been on any kind of medication for it before or since, but I ended up having to take happy pills, I'll leave out the name of the brand, and I'd never had to go through anything like that previously in my lifetime. Despite losing family members, growing up in early 1970s Belfast, being, caught up in the troubles, didn't have anything to do with that. And suddenly on a Saturday where I would go up and down the country watching my club, that had been taken away from us through no fault of our own. The work that the people behind Bury AFC, I was there from the first meeting in the Stanley Club. Has been absolutely immense. And to get at, yes, as James alluded to earlier on, there was a bit of a divide, and to a certain extent that still exists, but it's much less now, I feel, because the success that has been made of the job of bringing football back to the town of Bury. And it's not just the people, it's the local businesses. You can go into Bury Town Centre on a Saturday lunchtime, and you've got football fans there going for a pint and a bit of lunch, and then making their way down to Gig Lane. That's back. Okay, it's not as big as it was when we were in the EFL, because the crowd that go to watch our current opposition, the likes of West Didsbury are probably an anomaly, but to say that the likes of Padiham or Barn Olswick, fabulous supporters, fabulously run clubs, and we when we go there, they absolutely love the numbers that Bury take up there. Every ground in the Northwest Counties Football League Premier Division, we have set attendance records at every single ground we've gone to. We put money into those local economies. I remember the first time we went to the Isle of Man, we got a letter back saying, how well the Bury fans had behaved, and I think it came from the chief constable of the Isle of Man police, saying, "Brilliant, you guys are more than welcome because you put £500,000 into our local economy over a weekend with hotels and beer and restaurants and all the rest of it." And that's when we were in the football league, going to places like Rotherham or Stoke or Blackpool, we would go over. Our percentage of away support was something like 30% of our home support.
Would you say then that the community support that you've had to put the club back together again, that's been perhaps the best happy pill, as you put it, that you could have?
Absolutely. The number of sponsors that we've had who previously didn't engage with the club has gone tenfold, and we're very grateful to each and every one of them. But the finances are managed so well these days. We are never ever going to allow our football club to be controlled by one individual, who their decision is law. We won't have that. We make decisions, or our elected board members make decisions for the benefit of the club, because every single person who's a member at Bury FC owns part of the club, including myself. And I do it. My daughter does it. I even have my grandson. Both my grandsons are both members, and they own part of the club as well.
Niall, just moving on to Niall now. Hearing these stories, Niall, from Fair Game's perspective, these stories really are very much at the heart of what you and Fair Game are working for.
Yeah, absolutely, Graham. I think for us, the power of football in a community is massive. The emotion it provides for the community is massive. The impact it has on local businesses is massive. And I think that's the bit that we need to look to protect. And when I look at the potential independent regulator and the powers it has, it is way beyond just protecting a financial industry, because football is far bigger than just your ordinary kind of industry. It's part of the community ethos and society of this nation. And I think
Yeah.
that's the bit that's really key. So when we look at it, who do you want to be running our football clubs? Do you want an owner that
Yeah.
hasn't been properly checked over? Do you want an owner that is going to be gambling the future and the history and traditions of a football club? Is exactly what happened with Bury and what happened, very nearly happened with Bolton Wanderers. Do you want that to happen again? It certainly happened with my club, AFC Wimbledon. So for me, that needs to be protected. And then the other question is that financial revenue, the bit that David talks about, and you hear the kind of issues that happen with Mo that cause the bits that with Mo or Martin would have talked about with Ken Anderson and so on. That's the key. Looking at that huge gap, and that's a bit that you've got a chance to rectify with an independent regulator. And I think this is where, we're on the cusp of something that could protect all those football clubs, all those hundreds of professional football clubs that litter and make our game so special and strengthen the English football pyramid. Because there, we look at, on fair game perspective, we look at 164 clubs. We go down to National League North and South. And each of those is the heartbeat of those communities. And that's the bit that we believe really needs to be protected and what makes football so very, very, very special. It's way beyond a financial business, and it's way beyond. It shouldn't really rest in the hands of a few people that aren't thinking about what it means to those millions of football fans that go every Saturday.
It's a compelling argument.
That's the difference it is.
Yeah, it's a compelling argument now, but the Premier League has all the cash. And this very week, West Ham Vice Chair Baroness Karen Brady has said that we don't need a football regulator. And she argues it could change the Premier League's competitiveness, I should say. And in turn, she argues it would have a negative impact on the football pyramid itself. I mean, and they have the power, they have the money. How do you move from there?
They do. And this is where I think that you've got the opportunity of a regulator to look beyond it, because the Premier League is a fantastic organisation for doing the remit of the Premier League. And the remit of the Premier League is to protect its shareholders, and its shareholders are the 20 largely billionaire owners of football clubs. And even they don't necessarily have to care about the fans or the supporters of those clubs, and certainly have no reason. I mean, there's been no agenda, and we've spoken to people who've been on those board meetings. The likelihood of them discussing the plight of, say, Grimsby or Bury or Bolton or Newport or Lincoln is never going to be on their agenda. They're simply not important. It's not part of what they think about. And at the moment, the Premier League is the de facto regulator. So that's the issue. When they talk about the risk it has to their competitiveness in Europe, at the moment, the Premier League's wealth is 2.5 times than the nearest league. And what creates a strong ecosystem within the UK, in my opinion, and I think Fair Game's opinion, is the strength of our pyramid and the love that the game creates. Now, you could have potentially your own, what you might call a brand club, like an Arsenal or a Spurs, but the club that you go and see, the club that's at your heart, is likely to be the Burys, the Boltons, the Wimbledons, and so on. And I think that's the key. So it's naive of some people within the Premier League, and certainly Karen Brady, I believe, to think that isn't the bit that strengthens the game, because it's the fans that we talk about, what Yasmin and James and their constituents, their towns and cities they're the bits that really strengthen football, and that's the bit, and it creates that long-term sustainability and the long-term strength of our game in this country.
Yasmin, the Football Governance Bill is currently at the report stage at the House of Lords. What whispers are you hearing in Westminster as to its progress?
I think it will progress well. I mean, I think it was legislation, as you know, that the Conservative government were trying to introduce, and then I think the general election happened. It's come back in, and I'm sure that it will progress, because I think everybody, as Nell and everybody's saying, right, I mean, football is so much psyche of our country that we can't just, and I think most people understand that. And I think apart from the billionaire owners of Premier Leagues, right, I think everyone else, the ordinary people who go and watch the teams, who actually involved in managing of it, know that the game needs to be protected, and it needs to be protected at a local level as well as at the international, because the glamorous level, I call it, international level. It needs to be based and rooted in community. I think people should be able to, local clubs need to flourish. I mean, it's great on a Saturday, so many people come together every single week, even sometimes in a really horrible weather, people want to get out there. And as I say, I was drawing the comparison between, another country when one particular game is in their psyche. Well, for me, looking at it, it's so much part of us. So I think there's a lot of people who have good wishes, and I think a lot of people do understand the importance of having, club football at so different levels, so that people can be engaged. And I always thought that the Premier League should pay more money, and secondly, the price of the tickets should come down. I know it's being idealistic, but I don't see why we can't continue to campaign and push for that. And I intend to do so. And I know there are many other parliamentary colleagues like James and others who will do so as well.
Martin, I'll come to you in a moment if I may, but James, how do you respond to the clubs in the Premier League who say we don't need a football regulator, football can and should look after itself?
Well, they should have got their house in order sooner, in truth. And it's not for those at the very top to ignore the difficulties and the sustainable issues that we face throughout the pyramid. Clubs, in my view, that recognise the need for better regulation are the ones that understand the pressures that we've described and the experiences that we've described in today's recording. Look, the Conservatives have backed away. They're explicit now, as I understand it, in not supporting the football regulator and its journey through Parliament. We got a sense that was happening with the sheer volume of amendments and tag and drags added to the bill by virtue of amendments in the Lords, and Baroness Brady, as a Conservative peer, will be chief among them in opposing it, as well as somebody that both supports and runs two different Premier League football clubs. So look, I've sat with Richard Masters at the Premier League. I find the Premier League to be good engagement. Stakeholders there, they don't mind open disagreement on issues, and long may that continue. Had the Premier League and the EFL managed to sort out and see past some of the personalities, perhaps, and the politics of this, and sorted themselves out sooner, we might not need to be regulating. But the prompt for this was Bury's ejection, followed quickly by the appalling Super League idea, that through a quite instinctive leader in the form of Boris Johnson, to adopt rules or adopt some policies going into an election that landed him somewhere the other side, with a successful mandate that he squandered, and we all know the history and how that played out. In truth, at the heart, a football regulator needs to wrestle with some of that imbalance, some of that inequality that David speaks so well to. I'm not a view that this sort of solves everything. I don't think we need additional bureaucracy as sort of silver bullet. I don't think it solves or resolves everything anyway, not least because in Bury's case, we wouldn't feature within the remit of this regulator, such as the league position that we're in. But notwithstanding that, if we were in that position, the backstop, as you like, it doesn't prevent a future ejection of a football club. And the answer to that I've asked of both Secretary of State and the Deputy Director is, can this prevent another Bury? Is, well, of course we would apply those regulations this time round. Well, the regulations still exist as to why we shouldn't be in this position in the first place. So and we're seeing all over the place the failure of regulators and the failures of regulation. Enforcement has to count for a lot more than it does, and people need to be punished for their part in that woeful behaviour. So I keep an open mind on its progress. I will be supporting it as a Labour MP, but I think the scrutiny of it and where it ends up is very important. So it's not a finished article as yet.
I want to come to David in a moment, but Martin, you had a point you wanted to make.
Yeah, a couple of things. Niall and I watched the House of Lords debate one day recently. And it's not just the very annoying filibustering of Karen Brady on behalf of the Premier League. Lord Jackson of Peterborough stood up at the end of the debate when I was there and said, why should the Premier League give any money to the pyramid? It's a business. Well, I'm sorry, that's a worrying extension of extremism, because I think 14 of the Premier League clubs are owned by American outfits, billionaires, and they have a franchise model. There's no reason why we'll see another Wimbledon, respect to Niall, where they'll decide that maybe Nottingham or somewhere isn't the best place. There's more money to be made if they move it to somewhere completely different. And you could see that happening. That to me is worrying, but it's not just the Premier League either. And we look at the FA, where they brought in, without consultation, they stopped the replays in the FA Cup at the behest of the big clubs who weren't even involved in the early rounds. They could have had replays in the early rounds, and that's a big income stream for certain clubs if they get lucky enough to draw a big away team. It's right. It's all levels of football that need regulating. The FA and various other organisations have proved themselves incapable of regulating themselves.
David, Martin talks about different models. I know you've looked at the supporter ownership models in Germany, which on the surface appear to be working. Is that a way forward? I mean, should that be very much at the top of the agenda?
Well, I'm really glad you asked me that, Graham, because that's always been the dream. It's always been the ideal. And so here we've got Niall and Mo, where the rescues of both of their clubs came from supporters coming together and seeing that the supporter-owned model, which is what they've both got right now, where Mo was talking about every fan being an owner, being a shareholder, and also AFC Wimbledon. They've had, and Niall can jump in and correct me if I don't describe this correctly, but there've been periods where, because of AFC Wimbledon's financial constraints, there have been periods where it's been considered about bringing an investor in, and the supporters have absolutely resisted that and said, we didn't fight this hard to have our own club and our own fan-owned model, mutual ownership model, to then just give it all away. Now, I've covered this, Graham, right from the very beginning. So, I've been covering this, this issue of the money in football, the inequality between the Premier League and the rest, and the fact that the Premier League was a breakaway from sharing. So all these issues and all these questions about there needs to be more sharing of money from the top through the rest of football. As I said before, that was something that was recognised literally at the very beginning of professional football in 1888. But the first division clubs, as they were then, managed to break away from that model in 1992, and that is what the Premier League was. It was a breakaway league from the sharing arrangements of the Football League. But the thing is, you can become very old still banging on about this. And sometimes I get asked to do talks to university students, about these issues, and start banging on in my usual ranting way about 1992, and suddenly realize that all the students sitting in the room weren't born till really quite a long time after 1992, and I really need to stop being the boring old bald bloke that's still going on about something that happened 30 years ago. But the thing is, that is but it's very good to have the opportunity to explain this. That is the fundamental structure of the game. And the structure that we have now is not the historic traditional structure of the game that built the pyramids, and as Niall said, built the pyramid from which the big clubs grew and emerged. And so I think it's great, and it's the result of relentless campaigning by the Football Supporters Association, by Supporters Direct, who merged with the Football Supporters Association, but they're the ones who really promoted the supporter ownership model. And really, it's their efforts. Like James obviously is absolutely right to talk about what the political moment was that led Boris Johnson to actually go for the regulator idea in the end, and Labour are got that in the manifesto, and they've got legislation going through now. But that has only come about due to the efforts of supporters and the Football Supporters Association. And
Agreed.
there was a review by the politician Tracy Crouch, which basically recommended, I think, a regulator, and she very much worked with the Football Supporters Association to make all her analysis and recommendations. So therefore, and I've been around all through like the 30 years, which can sound quite sad, that all of these issues have been debated, and that supporters, the more you look at it, the more firmly you believe that this structure should change and isn't right for football. And I know it doesn't suit the big clubs at the top, and they kind of think that it's a threat to the money that they're making. But everybody, there's been so many reviews and inquiries, and they all come to this same conclusion. So the regulator and the introduction of the regulator is actually a great victory for the analysis and for the supporters' like tireless efforts to seek reform and better governance in football. And it could be just a start, like, it gets established and it has a certain remit, but then it enables this wider debate about the structure of the game, about the distribution of the huge revenues from the top that Yasmin and Niall have been talking about, and the ownership models and greater involvement of supporters, and trying to incorporate some idea of democracy and of mutuality, as you say, that they have in Germany, even in the top clubs. I think that it facilitates that debate as well. So it's actually really a remarkable historical development that, in the end, the governing parties have seen the value and the need for a regulator.
Mo, this is great stuff from David, and really puts things into perspective. But from Bury's point of view, from a fan's point of view, you're currently playing in League 9, I think it is. What ambition can you have in the next few years before all of this perhaps comes to fruition?
Well, our ultimate aim is to get back to the Football League. And it is going to take us a few years, but we will get there. I'm a shaker to the core, and I have faith in what we're doing and how we're doing it, and eventually we will get back to the EFL. Now, just going back to what David was saying, as a football supporter in general, I mean, I'm a self-confessed football junkie. I will watch football all day, every day. The introduction of a regulator is over 30 years too late, because the same year that the Premier League was established, Maidstone United were expelled from the Football League in 92-93 season because of ownership issues, and they went bust and they were expelled from the league because that season, Bury's final league game of the season was away at Maidstone, and because it was one of the few grounds that I hadn't been to, and I've been since, but it was a bit of a blow. But the impact for the local Maidstone community, I remember talking to a couple of guys who were down there, so I was partly involved with the Bury fanzine in those days, and we were talking to some of these guys and trying to raise a few quid here and there for them to try and get their club stabilized so that they could start again as Bury did in 2019. But this has been going on for, as I say, over 30 years. And we see countless clubs going into administration: Wimbledon, Wigan, Reading, Charlton, Portsmouth, Derby County, because they've had poor owners who have not been under any scrutiny by the authorities that govern the game of football in the UK. And it's not just English football. Look at what happened to a club the size of Glasgow Rangers. You know, I mean, and now I read yesterday that they're talking about American investment. You know, are we? These are our crown jewels of sport in this country. You know, football is our national game, from Land's End to John O'Groats, you know, from Newport County to, you know, Glentoran in Northern Ireland, Linfield, all of these clubs. These are they're the heartbeat of every single community across the United Kingdom. And this governance has been sorely lacking for such a long time. And you know, how has it taken so long for the people at the top of, you know, top echelons of government to realise that there is a national problem with our national game? We haven't governed the you know, they've not been accountable. They've
No,
just not been accountable either to their own supporters, because, you know, they've got a few quid and they own the club and what they say goes. And the fan model, as used in Germany, as David was alluding to earlier, for me, that's got to be the way forward.
let me just finally put the last question to Niall, if I can. I mean, it's a very passionate answer that Mo has just given us, but to bring it sort of into stark reality, again, coming back to Karen Brady, she said, look, there's no problem in football. She hears what Mo and others are saying. There's no problem in football. And she's even suggested that the regulator is going to be a person who's looking for a problem. I mean, that's the argument you've got to come up against. What will you say?
I think she's
Well,
alluded.
I mean, I think for football fans, the future of the game, that's where we're looking at. So we're looking at those clubs that want to see and can see a fairer and brighter future for football, because there are, you know, moments where football is magical for the communities, and it's that bit that we need to kind of come back to and remember. And then that's why, you know, why fair game exists, why the clubs that back fair game do so, why the supporters groups that back fair game do so, why so many politicians do so. And I think that's the bit you need to bring it back to. So it is about that essence of what the game brings, and that's where, you know, maybe Karen Brady doesn't exist in that particular bubble or that framework or that understanding, and you know that's a bit sad. But what we do is we look for that brighter future, and it is there, and we can see how close it is. That independent regulator offers the opportunity to present and build something that's different. And when David talks about that fight and the battle that's gone on for 30 plus years to get to this point, we're on the cusp of something quite remarkable to kind of fix some of those fundamental problems that caused the hike at Bury and Bolton. And I think we should definitely make sure that we grasp it and grasp it with two firm hands, and that we end up with a regulator that has the teeth and the power and the ability to do so and to protect all those communities, those clubs, those history, that tradition, and so on. And that's where we're at. And I think, you know, this conversation that we've had today shows how powerful and meaningful football is. And we should never forget that.
Panel, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed it, do please subscribe to the Fair Game podcast. You can find it on all the usual channels. I'm Graham Miller. The producer is Ian Beach. And until the next edition of We Love Your Football, it's goodbye for now.
Fair Game represents 34 men's professional football clubs, all united with a common aim of delivering a fairer future for football. We want to see a game where every fan can put on their club shirt, proud in everything it stands for, and safe in the knowledge that their club will be there for the long haul. We work with the nation's leading experts to develop realistic solutions to the game's problems, and then lobby the government and the authorities to try and adopt them. We are a volunteer-run organisation, and if you want to help Fair Game or donate, please check out our website www.fairgameuk.org.